in humanities and public health, making profit from providing healthcare and private healthcare without profit. Is there a conflict? Yesterday's webinar dealt with extraordinary multidisciplinary perspectives at the systems level, privatization of health, using markets and health systems. Today's webinar is more at the individual level, the patient level. Are patients or consumers? The distinguished panelists for today's webinar are Amar Jesani, ethicist, founder of the Indian Journal of Medical Ethics; Tulsi Patel, sociologist, former professor and head of department sociology at the Delhi University and Delhi School of Economics; Inayat Singh Kakkar, health lawyer, patients' right activist and health workers activist; Mark Sheehan, philosopher, faculty, Department of Philosophy, Oxford University, and fellow at the Epoch Center. And finally, K. Srinath Reddy, President, Public Health Foundation of India, formerly Head of Department Cardiology at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi. I now request Dr. Reddy to give an overview, moderate, and chair the proceedings. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Shafalika. Well, the relationship between two human beings, which goes beyond the system in which they operate, defines the person who is seeking care for a health condition and the person who is providing that care, whether it's a doctor or a nurse or a technician. But quite often we are finding that this relationship is getting vitiated into a commercial transaction, which goes beyond the initial humane dimensions which defined the profession of medicine or health. And there we are actually seeing an increasing tendency, even as technology is enabling us to make even greater advances in providing timely and efficient care, whether in diagnostics or whether in treatment procedures. But increasingly, the wall that is appearing between the care provider and the person seeking the care is becoming quite formidable. But the problem is more than the separation which sometimes this impersonal connection brings. There is also the problem of what is the commercialization of medicine, which makes the relationship very transactional. And that is where terminology such as consumer of care comes in. Well, consumer is a bit of a problem when we discuss this relationship between a doctor and a patient, even though the Consumer Rights and Consumer Protection Act may provide some relief. Is that the only avenue by which one has to seek relief? And should it become a matter of litigation when the relationship has been marred by a transactional element? So to discuss all of these, we need to look at how the medical profession has evolved and how it is evolving. Even though we did discuss systems yesterday, ultimately it revolves around how persons perceive and interact with persons within that system. And therefore, the relationship between the doctor and the patient has to be examined very closely. It so happens that all of us, including those on the panel, at some point in time of our lives, have actually sought care. We too were actually patients or seeking one form of health service or other, or some of our family members sought care. And we also recognized what the positives were and what the negatives were in those kind of relationships when others were providing care. So distilling all of these experiences, but trying to find out how best we can actually redefine these relationships in order to improve the relationship between those seeking care and those providing the care is going to be very important. And particularly at a time when we are talking about moving from a patient-centric to moving to a patient-centric model, from a physician-centric model, from a paternalistic model of healthcare to a partnership and a participatory model of making decisions, we have to really look at these in great depth. Ultimately, it devolves around how much care, courtesy, concern, and compassion that we can bring in to our relationship, and whether the commercialization of medicine is actually eroding those elements. As Peabody had said, the secret of caring for patients is caring for the patient. Are we doing a reasonable job in that or not? Dr. Jasani, as a physician and as an ethicist who have been studying health systems in India and elsewhere, how do you see the evolution of this relationship between the medical caregiver and the person who is seeking care? And particularly, what is the nature of the commercial influence which is beginning to corrode this relationship of trust?
Thanks a lot for inviting me here and for this interesting topic. Well, I studied medicine in 1970s, and that was in Gujarat, in Baroda. And Gujarat, you know, is highly commercialized otherwise. So this was in the public institutions. Medicine was highly paternalistic at the time. I don't remember having a good idea of the concept of autonomy and informed consent at that time. As we were in the medical school, they were completely neglected. They were not talked about. And yet, at that time, when the paternalism was at the height, the focus was quite a lot on the doctor and doctor's conduct. And I remember that my teachers continuously told me that doctor-patient relationship is very sacred. You should not allow any other consideration to come in the way. And you must ensure that you do not bring your own personal prejudices or the other aspects or your pecuniary benefits in relationship with the patient. 1980s, the Consumer Protection Act comes in 1986 and all, and the more and more economy opens up. There is a more talk about autonomy, but there is a less and less focus on the doctor. I think this is what the thing has changed in the course of time. So the larger structure does impact the way medicine is practiced and the relationship between the doctors and patient. As the market penetrated more and more in the transaction, the relationship kept changing. The initial thing was very simple, as I was taught, that the patient's best interest is the one that you must look at. It is not any other interest of yours. And that's how, you know, the issue of conflict of interest, which is now very prominent and which undermines the patient's interest, was talked about without having such direct connection with those conflicting elements in that period. On the other hand, the other thing that we were told was, as I was telling you, is about the fidelity. That you must be loyal to your patient all the time. And that loyalty is very, very important. And that's where I found in government setting during 1970s when I was studying medicine, a lot of conflict coming up. And we had talked about it also, the doctor being given targets to do certain kind of, say, family planning operations and that kind of stuff. Those were the issues which were not related to the conflict of interest in terms of having financial relationship with the outside entity, but it was having your loyalty to the state as compared to the loyalty to the patient. And that's where in most of the state control or state finance healthcare system, those issues come up. And that was talked about quite a lot in that context, that how do you come under pressure there? But the fidelity to the patient was considered to be a very, very important issue, along with the best treatment for the best interest of the patient there. So this whole transition from paternalism to the autonomy, has a lot of shares in between that we need to keep in mind, depending upon how the system as it is changing in India in different places affect that relationship. I'll just end here and we'll take it up as the other issues come up during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. You brought out a very important point. It's not just the commercial sector. Even the state set targets can also be transactional in the sense and impose a great conflict of interest for the caregiver, who ought to act as the natural attorney of the patient, but often is used as an instrument of either the state or the corporate entity. Well, Professor Tulsi Patel, you're a social scientist. You've seen social dynamics at play, and you've seen how the health system has been operating. What are your views on this particular matter of the patient being turned into a consumer and the doctor becoming a tech-savvy trader?
Ma'am, you're muted. You're muted, ma'am.
Unmute. She doesn't listen.
Ma'am, you have to unmute. We can't hear you.
Somebody will have to call her up. Yeah.
Is it okay now?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay.
And we can see
Yeah,
you
thank
as
you,
well.
Dr. Reddy. Thank you for inviting me to this interesting webinar. The whole issue of the patient becoming a consumer and the doctor being a tech-savvy specialist is interesting in the sense that it has taken a fairly long time to turn health for a patient into service as a commodity. Health has become a commodity, and when we look at the provision of health as a commodity, more in private practice, then the relationship between the doctor and the patient is in some ways colored by conflict of interest. The patient's interest and the doctor's interest may be common in terms of regaining health, but the other aspects, which are more pecuniary aspects, there is some conflict of interest. And this is revealed in the manner in which private practitioners provide services, investigations, diagnostics, procedures to patients with different kinds of health insurance and with no health insurance. So it does make a difference if you're carrying a health insurance with you. If you've not bought a health insurance, your relationship is different. So there is a multiplex relationship in terms of or we could say a multi-layered relationship where the doctor and the patient are both interested in healthcare. They both want that the patient should regain health, but at the same time, the doctor is under some pressure to generate money, and the patient is also under pressure to be able to at least get the feeling. It is like a bargain where we go, and if we need to bargain somewhere, then it becomes a problem. You are never satisfied that you've been cheated or not. And that is the feeling which many patients have recounted when they've come out of private hospitals, corporate hospitals, and clinics. So it is a very difficult relationship that is emerging, and people prefer to go to private hospitals if there is a good insurance. Otherwise, they do not want to go to private hospitals and want to go to public hospitals. But this relationship between public provision, doctors at the public provision facilities and doctors at private provision facilities is clear. But at the public provision facilities, because perhaps the country does not have the kind of percentage GDP that is spent on public health compared to maybe Portugal or New Zealand or Germany, where between 8 to 12% of the GDP is spent on public health. So if that kind of money is spent on public health and there is a good provision. I think the relationship in the public health sector might be far, far better as far as the relationship between doctors and patients or any health provider staff and patients is concerned. Otherwise, the overload with 1% GDP spent in public health is a problem. So on the one hand, you have private practitioners where there is some conflict of interest, and you have public practitioners who really have conflict of time because of the load. So that is the kind of difficulty that perhaps we are undergoing, or India as a country is undergoing at the moment.
Thank you very much. Well, you brought at a very important point that much of this is also being dictated now by the patient's paying capacity, and particularly whether the patient is being covered by health insurance or not.
Yes.
And that is also resulting in a very differentiated approach. Yes, indeed, this has become quite a cynical affair. But in 1980s, some of my classmates who went to the United States used to say that the commonest indication for tonsillectomy there is Blue Cross Blue Shield, which is a health insurance, medical insurance program. And recently, I heard them saying that the commonest diagnostic procedure performed in the US is a wallet biopsy to find out how much money the patient has. But that is the level of cynicism that has come into medical care, medical practice. And
Right.
that is something that we really need to avoid and try and redress. Now, Dr. Sheehan, you're a philosopher of medicine and health. And from your perspective in studying the philosophy of human relations, how would you position this business of making the patient into a consumer and trying to make this all into a transactional relationship?
Thanks very much, Dr. Reddy, and thanks, Shifalika, for asking me along to this to be a part of these two seminars. There's a couple of things that I wanted to touch on, and I actually want to largely build on some of the things that Amar Jesani started with, and just to sort of to think through the process by which we get to this commercialization stuff. So the doctor-patient relationship is obviously very important, and I think in that trade-off that Amar described between paternalism and autonomy, I think is really very important. One of the ways in which I think about this context is what are the sorts of things, the sorts of external influences on that relationship that represent particular kinds of intrusions. And obviously, I think a market or commercial incentives, the consumerist idea, or one of the ways I would like to put it as a sort of the profit motive, is obviously going to be one of the things that gets in the way and intrudes on that decision-making process. But I'd like to just spend a minute about just reflecting a little bit on something that did come up earlier, and I think Dr. Reddy, you picked this up in Amar's after Amar's comments, is the ways in which the state can intrude on that relationship. And this is something that I've worked on in the past. When in the UK the move was made in terms of the allocation of healthcare resources in the NHS, there was a move from it being made at a sort of regional level to it being made by general practitioners, so by primary care. And one of the things that I was worried about at the time was exactly this kind of intrusion into the doctor-patient relationship. So the worry was a patient goes to their GP and they're worried that the GP is not treating them and not keeping that relationship sacrosanct. And instead they had another eye onto making the healthcare system more efficient and conserving resources in one way or another. Now, the reason that's interesting, I think, is because it's a state version. it's a limited resources version of the sort of intrusion that we're worried about in the case of consumerism. So the question then, I think that's really largely all in line with what we've already said. I mean, I think the thing to recognise as a result of that, and again, this picks up on Tulsi Patel's the comments just preceding about these conflicts of interests. I mean, I think in that relationship between doctor and patient, there are necessarily interventions from the different people in it. So we are all people with multiple interests, and doctors are people with that. And the system can function with us wearing different hats and managing those interests. But of course, we need to be careful about how those interests are managed. I want to come back to that point in just a minute. But just to turn to the way in which markets intrude. So we worry about that, and we worry about the sort of cynicism and the skepticism that arise because of the market setting. But there's a question here, I think, that's important about whether or not, how exactly do we understand the nature of the ethical concern about the profit motive. And there's a discussion in the philosophy literature about the nature of the threat that the profit motive brings to other kinds of activities, and in particular health, right? So the question here is, if we introduce a market into healthcare, either at the level of the practitioner or at the level of the system, do we undermine the aims and goals of healthcare? And so in the debate that I just wanted to describe for you is the question of whether or not a market or whether or not a profit motive necessarily undermines the values of healthcare, or whether it does it contingently. And I think it's really important to distinguish between these two, because if it was true that what a market does and the profit motive does is it encroaches on everything and it waters everything down. So whenever we have a market, we can't have any other values. Or is it contingently corrosive? That's the term that's used in the literature. And a colleague of mine from Australia is a guy called Adrian Walsh, who's a philosopher from the University of New England, has written on this and written very well on it. And he talks about this distinction between whether or not markets are necessarily or contingently corrosive. Now, what follows from this debate is that if they're necessarily corrosive, that is, if markets necessarily eat away at our other values and so eat away at the doctor-patient relationship, then we can't allow them to do that, right? So we can't allow markets into healthcare. But if they're contingently corrosive, that is, if they undermine the values of healthcare some of the time, but not all the time, then we have a different set of strategies. So then the strategy seems to be more like we need to be careful about how we manage markets in healthcare. And we need to sort of regulate and manage and control that just to make sure that those tendencies don't. Now, I agree with Adrian Walsh's work on this. That is, I think it's more plausible that the profit motive is contingently corrosive rather than necessarily so. So I think the ways in which we need to respond to markets and profit in healthcare is to manage it. And that would be, I think, my thought. There is, of course, a big question about how we manage it. And I think that's really important. So I want to come back to this sort of last question about how we might think about that. And Dr. Reddy, I wanted to pick up on something that you said at the end of yesterday's seminar, when you talked and you summed up the discussion really well, I thought, by saying that you know, what the real key thing for a healthcare system is that it satisfies these four principles. That it needs to be beneficent, needs to be beneficial to patients and the users of the system. It needs to be safe. It needs to be cost optimizing, and it needs to provide satisfaction for those people working. And I completely agree with you about that. I thought that was really well put. I think the thing that I wanted to say is, and you certainly touched on this, is that how we manage a market and how we manage markets in healthcare is consistent with managing all of those things. And I think you said that we need to think about the ways in which the system can control and manage the ways in which those relationships take place. So what we don't want is exactly the sorts of things that Tulsi Patel has described. We don't want people being distrusting their clinician. We don't want them distrusting the healthcare system. But it seems to me that there are ways of constructing things so that we can trust the system, but we do that in a context where there are market forces and marketing. And just your point about cost optimizing. I mean, in the UK, there's a lot of debate about rationing and those sorts of things, and certainly through the recent the pandemic in terms of rationing care and intensive care access, and that's very much about cost optimization. And so those sorts of decisions, going back now to the doctor-patient relationship, they're the things that intrude, and they ought to intrude, right? So the doctor can't, it seems to me, ethically pay no attention to the system in which they work. But that, of course, is in a healthcare setting. When it comes to the market, I think we've got a bit more work to do, and markets in healthcare. And I'll just sort of end on this thought. Healthcare systems are getting more and more expensive, and particularly research. I mean, research is a good example. The costs of research are exorbitant now, and that's partly to do with artificial raising of that. But I do think that it's reasonable for governments and for states to resort to using markets and investment as a way of funding healthcare systems. I don't necessarily think that it's always the way to go, but I do think that it's a reasonable answer. I don't think it's unreasonable that they do that. But what I think they do need to do, and this is where we come back to the doctor and the patient, is they do need to insulate the doctor and the patient from those kinds of transactions in a way that they can't do when they and they can't insulate the doctor and the patient from discussions about resource allocation. There's a lot of things left to figure out about that, namely, how do you have a system which allows commercial interests, but you don't allow that to filter down to the system. That's a very difficult set of questions, and one to be hopefully talked through a bit more. Thank you.
Thank you. Has our fourth panelist joined us, or she's unable to join?
No, I'm sorry, there's been a medical emergency at her end. So she's given me a few points. And the essential point, what she wanted to make, is that the consumerist approach in healthcare is leading to a reductionist approach in India, whereby, out of 30 patients, one would go to the court, and the court cases go on for a decade or 2 decades, and some compensation is then awarded to the patient. What she says is that it leads to looking at what compensation that individual patient gets. And the hospitals are very happy with that, but it doesn't correct the systemic errors. And the systemic errors keep continuing happening, and it gets more and more common and prevalent. So that was the main point Inayat said if I could put across. She's unable to join, so.
Thank you. Well, Dr. Sheehan has brought out very important points. Basically, while recognizing that there is a market failure in health, and that's generally been agreed by most economists as well, despite the fact that many people in India who are trying to commercialize the healthcare sector do not recognize that market forces have a limitation in health. But he has also brought in the concept that it can be contingently corrosive, and therefore we must recognize where market might operate well and where it does not operate well, and then have suitable market interventions or make the corrections as needed. But certainly that's a very interesting way to look at how best we in India in particular with our mixed health system should be able to adapt our responses. Let me pose a question to Amar, and then others can also take it up. And then we can have a little bit of round robin between the panelists. With the Consumer Act coming in, and even before that, you had the professional associations coming in, whether the Indian Medical Association or others. And over a period of time, we have seen them taking up very defensive positions and sometimes even offensive when there are some consumer protection measures brought in by the government. Is there a progressively worsening adversarial relationship between the people seeking medical care and the people providing medical care? And are the professional associations exacerbating the problem with their defensive posturing?
Oh, yeah, this is a very profound question, and I think I'll connect it with few other questions that were raised earlier. I think the first thing is about defining consumer. What is consumer? Because we are talking about consumer and patient and consumer and patient, and 80s was a defining period for that, when actually the real liberalization started in India and the neoliberal policies were implemented. It came up in a big way from early 90s, but 80s, Rajiv Gandhi's regime was quite a liberal regime as well. The point is, when you say consumer, and the way legally we define a consumer means that somebody who is paying. And how you are paying? You are making direct transactional payment, as Dr. Reddy was talking about, maybe through the insurance or the out-of-pocket payment. And as a consequence, it has created a kind of an understanding that only those who can pay, they have a real stake in the healthcare. They can get it. The rest can't. And rest, even they are given as charity. And so the attitude of those who are providing it is very, very different. So I think this distinction between consumer and patient has a huge, profound impact since 1980s in Indian psyche, both among the patients as well as among those who are providing the care. And again, we can talk about that. Legal access to the consumer courts is only for those people who have paid, not for those people who are not paid. That means government services which does not charge for the care directly are out of the bound of consumer court. So this is a very big area. Now, what has happened is that the medical associations have reacted unfavorably to it. Reason is very simple. I don't think it has anything to do with the number of cases coming to them. If you actually work out the statistics of the cases that have been filed against doctors, it will be very, very low as compared to the other countries. What is most important thing I think doctors found offensive was that they were being asked to become accountable to an authority which was not a medical authority chosen by them. They have been very comfortable in the medical councils where they were trying their own people or not trying their own people, despite all the complaints going from the patients. And they always felt that this was their empire and nobody can touch it. At the same time, this is the profession which is highly committed to market. And I think we need to also look at, in context of Dr. Sheehan has said, is that we have to look at in that context, saying that what does market do? And I think once we talk about market and consumers, then those who are don't having wherewithal, they're all separate out. They just the market is inherently discriminatory, whether we like it or not. And that's where some of the major problem comes. And that's why many people argue that once the market operates in the healthcare system, as far as the value systems are concerned, the market value will crowd out the other values of the system, because that becomes the most important. Things have to keep running. There is a management will keep asking you accountability, saying that why your department is not making profit or not surplus coming from that. And you will have to do things which is to satisfy them. So it's very, very important that you look at the market in this, can market be regulated? And that's where our medical profession again comes in the picture. And that way even our healthcare hospitals will come in picture. Are the hospitals ready to be regulated? They don't. Doctors not ready to be regulated. So regulated market is a very, very good concept. And it may work if you have a state which is able to regulate, or you have system to regulate them. And there has to be at least a societal consensus that there are certain kind of people who need regulation and they should be voluntarily. And if they don't agree to do it voluntarily, then the state should be exercise the power to make them, to accept the regulation. This is not there. Actually, in neoliberal economy of ours, the powerful is controlling the state power. And to expect them to regulate themselves is extremely difficult. This is true with larger corporate. You know that how discussion about crony capitalism goes on in India, how certain houses are very, very powerful while the others are not. All these things show that the state needs to have impartiality and the will to regulate. But the last point that I want to make is, how, as you were asking me about relationship between doctor and patients and how it has got eroded, is very simple. Reason here is the decline of the trust in the doctor. And I think this is very interesting phenomenon that that many people have tried to study in India. That when system was highly paternalistic, the doctors were trusted the most. But trust was most of the time a very blind trust. Doctors were demigod. The patient was an ignorant fool who just will go and put his head on the feet of the doctor and say that you are my bap. Please do something, otherwise I'll die. And that's how they used to put their life in the hands of the doctor, and doctor used to react in a very paternalistic manner to the extent possible within the circumstances there as a general practitioner also. But with more and more market and with more and more information coming out that the doctors are not interested in actually caring, but they are interested in getting money, or the institutions which are even worse than that. And another thing that you will find in India, which is a preliminary thing any market regulation should do, is the prevalence of cut system, the commission, the invisible cost or the price that patients pay. And this is well known. I mean, you will find that the hospitals, big corporate hospitals, sending even a letter, formally a letter to the doctor saying that refer your patients here, you'll get 25% cut on this. Or the mobile laboratories providing that cut to them. This has completely eroded the trust between the doctors and the patient. And as a consequence, you'll find not so many cases, but direct action. There is too much of violence taking place against the system and the doctor. Individual doctors, particularly those doctors who are at the front line, they are suffering because patients get angry because they realize that going to the court, they will not get easy justice in India. Court case will go on for years because doctor is so powerful that he will drag you till the Supreme Court, even to give 5 lakh rupees or 10 lakh rupees compensation. And that is the reason why the more direct action starts taking place. And that's how the incidence of violence like that has happened in China. A lot of epidemic of violence in China. Same way there is epidemic of violence against doctors and hospitals in India. In China, at least they have spared, the gangsters who can be paid to go and attack the hospitals in order to, take your revenge. In India, so far such spares have not come. But the situation is as bad as that is described in China, where people's trust is eroded in the health system. I think these are the reason, I will say, why there is a lot of tension between those who are using the system or services and those who are sitting as providers there.
Well, let's hope we'll not come to the state where we'll have to have people paying Supari to teach a lesson to the doctors. Well, if they can pay a Supari, I'm sure they can pay the doctors
Well,
to
it
get
has
better
happened
service.
in 1990s in Bombay, where the Suparis were given to attack some of the doctors.
Well, Professor Patel, since clearly there has been a deterioration of relationship into an adversarial position, how do you think that we can actually restore trust between the caregivers and the care seekers at a personal level, at an institutional level, and if possible, at an association?
Should I?
Yeah, please. How do we heal this?
Wow, it's a very difficult question on healing. But I feel that if we could explore a little on how the trust has been eroded through the market forces, as Mark was talking. He, philosophically, he made this point of market forces intruding into relations between doctors and patients. It's true that both doctors and patients are under certain pressure because of the market. From paternalistic to autonomy, as Amar was saying, is a difficult situation, even if we see other relationships other than doctor-patient relationships, where rights are emphasized more than duties. Doctors are more safe in private establishments than in public institutions as far as violence is concerned. So the trust and the response of the patients and their families towards doctors because of that erosion of trust is something which is very disturbing. And it's more disturbing because the doctors who are not supari, but doctors who are having to meet violence or having to tolerate violence from patients' side are the ones who are in public hospitals rather than in private hospitals. And it seems as if the market is saving those doctors or is able to protect those doctors far better. One of my difficulties is, why do corporate hospitals and private hospitals not allow media people and social scientists to do some research in those establishments? You could go to a public hospital and with difficulty, not very easily, with difficulty get permission as a social scientist to do some investigation, some field work. But it is next to impossible to do that in a private hospital. Why is it so? Why are they so secretive? If it is and the other thing is the informed consent. When we talk about informed consent, it is something that has come from market, from this idea of autonomy and from consumption. A consumer may go to the market with some information. If he wants to buy a car, he wants to buy some gadget, he wants to buy some edible items. It is possible for most of the people to get some information about that and decide the choice. In health, when you make it a choice and a consumer item, it is very difficult. Medicine itself is half science, half art. So much of the clinician's practice and the finesse of the clinician is so important in medical practice, which is an art. It's a very big art compared to just science. But the thing is that there is less of art now and more of science. More and more of diagnostics, investigations, etc. is what doctors are depending on. And that is a big cost in diagnosis. So the cost factor is there. That is one reason why there is less of this trust. But I think there is also a time factor. Doctors do not have time with patients. Even in private establishments, it may be slightly better with some people, but very often they are jumping from one establishment to another, treating patients in one place, going to another place, going to a third place. So sometimes it becomes very difficult even to access the doctor if you want to meet the doctor or talk to the doctor at some point, even while you were a patient. So it becomes, in that sense, a very broken relationship instead of being an enduring relationship. And I say medicine is part art because the manner in which in private practice there is this regular thing about, at least in the reproductive field, regular issue of creating fear. There is so much fear created in the minds of pregnant women and their families that if they do not go for a cesarean section, the baby will die or the mother will die. And the difference between cesarean sections in private establishments and public establishments of healthcare are very large. So why do more people have cesarean sections in private establishments? There might be a certain element of choice in private institutions where people go by choice to go for a cesarean. But most of the time it is fear. And when you are in a vulnerable situation as a patient, at that point, if a doctor tells you that this is very, very scary and you might die, where is the issue of informed consent here? The informed consent is blown out of the window. It's very difficult to see this and compare this with a consumer who goes to the market to buy a commodity. It's not that easy. Human body is so complex. Doctors take years to understand parts of it. And then you think that the patient will have informed consent. I am not very sure if this kind of informed consent, when even in public hospitals, people do sign on informed consent forms, but there the paternalistic and the trust is far more than in the private hospitals. So these are complex issues and I don't think I have answers to it, but somewhere we need to really drive a balance between what is public good and what is private profit. Because there is no limit to profit. Whether you go into philosophy or mythology, once you get into profiteering, there is absolutely no limit. You could just keep chasing it till you die. But in some ways, if there could be certain limits to what is possible, how much could you get from the patients, how much you should not, what certain limits could be decided by private practitioners themselves or establishments or at a national level. In some way, this kind of policy could be there where, and a match between public hospitals and private hospitals could also be seen through policies. So somewhere that kind of thing might help. Otherwise, it's very difficult because in a country where you had doctors, indigenous doctors who would not even charge you, but whose life would be taken care of by the local people. From that stage, we have come to the complete, again, I mean, to a complete different pole where we are thinking in terms of money and making money out of health problems. Because from the Rashtriya Bima Yojana, there is research showing that women in the 30s, women in their 20s, there are hysterectomies being conducted on women in India in private hospitals. So if you have insurance, you might have more hysterectomies. And to say and to claim that because we are going for universal healthcare through universal insurance, I don't know if it is going to be more hysterectomies or something else. But we need to, in some ways, have some ethical consensus, maybe through policies, maybe through discussions, maybe through information, ethics, education. In some form, this must be discussed and this must be brought more to the public notice, and more. It should be more publicized that this is happening and this is what is happening between the doctors and patients. This is the issue of trust. This is the issue of market, and we need to be cautious about it. I don't know whether that will work, but I hope it works.
Thank you. Dr. Shehan, talking about contingently corrosive market forces, one of the challenges that we are facing in India, and we have seen that happen in China as well, is that markets are not just domestic markets now. These are transnational. Many of our corporate hospitals have sold themselves out to international ownership, or there is controlling interest. And even while we were lamenting that it is MBAs who are sitting and deciding how many procedures must be done by each doctor in each hospital, now you are having people sitting either in Dubai or Malaysia or USA deciding what the profit line should be in any Indian corporate institution. So in those circumstances, how do we actually bring in a greater degree of accountability and trust and bring the profession back into a caring mode, which is respectful of some of the patient rights as well as heeds its own ethical tenets?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Reddy. So, I mean, one thing I think is important to distinguish, and I certainly recognise how problematic it is. I mean, how problematic it is that you have overseas ownership of the hospital. And I think what makes that difficult and problematic is that the kinds of trade-offs that are being made aren't for the benefit of Indian patients. I mean, and that seems to be a really big problem. And so there's a sort of system problem about how to manage that, and there's a problem for the state and the government about how to ensure that the healthcare system is providing the best care that it can. But I think those sorts of questions, and if we look at the US, there's a similar set of problems, right? So, the problem in the US is people don't get access to care. They have a market system, but people don't have insurance, so people don't get care, and they don't get good care if they don't have the right kinds of insurance. And I think both of those are sort of systemic problems, and they're things that really urgently need to be addressed and urgently need to be managed. I think the problem in the UK doesn't quite have those sort of problems. It has different problems, but it doesn't have those problems which are about the sort of overall healthcare system being market-driven and market-managed. But what I think is interesting is that we can quite quickly assume that because of those higher level things, that the particular relationships between doctors and patients is affected. And I don't think that's necessarily true. That is, I don't think that it follows that because the people in Dubai own the hospital, that there are going to be problems on the ground about the doctor-patient relationship. And so I think the diagnosis here is a slightly different one. I'm not quite sure about the Indian setting. I mean, I think this is very specific tensions that Tulsi's referred to about the sort of proximity of the private and the public. But as an example, I mean, discussions about the doctor-patient relationship, exactly along the lines that Amar's been talking about the right balance between paternalism and autonomy. And those discussions happen in the United States, right? So what we don't get in the United States is we don't get an account, a clear account of patients necessarily distrusting their doctors. And yet they live in a system in which large swathes of the population don't get healthcare, right? So there's a systemic problem that the market brings, but it doesn't necessarily bring these individual ones. So I think in looking in India, I think the causes of this in India are going to be more specific to India and more specific to the ways in which the medical profession, for example, has subscribed to markets and bought into that. And there has been a lot of that stuff in the UK. So historically, when the NHS was set up, it was the general practitioners that wanted to keep it a market. They didn't want the socialised care, and they still don't. So they were the big problems at the time. And I wonder whether or not the work to be done here in re-establishing trust and as I see, getting the right balance here needs to come from inside the system rather than from these broad things. I do think they're a problem, but I'm not sure they quite address this problem.
Thank you. Shafalika, I suppose we can extend the session up to 5:15 and take a few questions from the audience.
So we have 67 participants, but there's only one question. And it's a myth to believe doctors in public sector service healthcare are protected in India. They are questioned by the industry union and media without fact analysis. Who are to provide security and autonomy to the medical professional? This is on behalf of the public doctors. So basically that it's a myth that they are protected is what Madhav Kulkarni is saying.
Amar, would you like to take that? Yes, I believe that doctors in public hospitals are also extremely vulnerable and they are under attack, not just physically, but even for their competence and commitment. So what do you have to say?
Well, they are definitely not protected the way it is being made out to be, in the sense that when you are in the private sector and doing private practice, you become an independent entrepreneur. And the independent entrepreneur has to earn living every day. And that is what normally in the medical circle talked about as being insecure, economically insecure, as compared to the government doctor who is having a salary. However, that security that you are talking about, anybody who is talking about it, not the questioner, is that security is not really providing you the status that is required of a doctor in the society. If you go in the medical circles, the doctors who are working in the public sector, bearing few, the premium institutions of the country like AIMS and all, the rest of the doctors in the public sectors are considered to be less, or inferior than the rest of them. You'll go in the medical associations meeting and you'll find that easily, because the power goes with those who really amass wealth, and that amassment at wealth is not always there in the public sector. One of the reasons why there is a lot of corruption among the doctors in the public sector is that the disparity in income at the level, like say a professor of medicine in the public sector, let's say in district hospital, what he earns is much, much, much less as compared to the comparable doctor who is in the private sector. And that inferiority complex is very strong. I've done a lot of studies in the government sector. My major work as a researcher has been health system studies. And I have lived with them and I've seen that day in and day out, the primary health sector doctor, primary health center doctor, the community health sector doctors, and the civil surgeon, civil hospital doctor will be talking about what is being earned outside as compared to what they are doing. And when I used to question them that why are you running your private services outside, they will say that if you want to have a status in this town, we have to do something. Otherwise, these doctors will never provide us any kind of power, any kind of respect. And so I think that whole issue of security in the government was there in my time in 1970s when I studied. Everybody used to aspire to go to the government services for security, but that is no longer there. They know that in market they have too many avenues to make money. The market in India is not at all regulated. My last point, I think I would like to react to what Mark said here. I think it's what point he is making, I have no problem. I agree that market can be regulated. But the context in which market is operating in India, how do you regulate? If you look at Europe and North America, particularly Canada, interwar period and post-Second World War period, they brought about huge structural changes in the system. They created a system which has been enduring for many years until Ronald Reagan came and Thatcher came and tried to really change it. There was hardly any discussion about the market and market's failure in say British system and NHS, right? So when you talk about market, it is being easy to control in those contexts is very different from a country like India, where what we call there is a jungle raj of market. If you want to really see what is laissez-faire, which never existed, it is only a theory. It never existed in Europe, even at the beginning of capitalism. That laissez-faire you will find in lot of medical practices in India, and that's where the problem lies. Who will control them and who will regulate them? So in a way, many of us, I mean, even Dr. Reddy, there is a high-level committee report talks about, a really excellent regulatory system, but that presupposes the fact that state has a will to do it, and that can be done if there is a separation between state and the corporates. The state can control the corporate, and corporate will have to do that. That is not happening in India. Prime Minister's office is more controlled by the corporates than the members of the parliament in the country. In that situation, I don't think it is going to be possible. That's why we have to see that our criticism of market is totally different from your criticism of market. And sometimes we say, yes, regulations are required and we'll fight for it. Even we go and do it in a street demonstration for regulation. But we know that that will not come about unless some more structural changes are carried out. And those structural changes are still not in place for the regulation to succeed in India. I think that's a major worry. And how to get those structural changes, I have no idea. And it requires a totally different kind of movement, just like we have farmers movement. I hope there'll be a patients movement like that, which will really barricade all the hospitals and all the politicians to force them to make some changes, to have at least a basic universal access, and on which you can build little bit of in-contracting system as GPs. GPs are not actually a private market system. It is contracted in. You can have collective bargaining with them and you contract them in, and then they have to work within that regulated field. So we can do contracting is not a bad idea, but how do you do it in India? When the corporates are so powerful that government will keep giving money to buy from there rather than contracting them in. They will never come and get contracted within the government, because then they will have to follow the dictates of the regulators, which they don't want. I think this is the major tragedy of my country, and that is where we have to have more rigorous work carried out and some alternatives found.
So there are three questions. Questions which I'll just combine together if there is 5 minutes in the interest of time. One of the common arguments for market-driven healthcare is that it promotes investment, innovation, and improvement. So they want an answer. They want the panel to share thoughts on this. The second is that the doctors, a lot of the problems in the public sector is due to overloading. So can't there be more doctors, like more seats? And the third question is, how effective can whistleblower policy be? Can it help to boost the trust in the system? So these are the, right. And what role does increasing privatization of the medical education play on the healthcare as a paid service?
Dr. Sheehan, let's start with you. Maybe a brief response, maybe taking the first question that was posed.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Reddy. I mean, if I could just make one put a point to add to Amar's there. I mean, I think the other thing that we really need to seriously consider here is the scale of India. I mean, I think all of the examples I've given, and when we think about Europe and the UK and Canada and the US, it's much smaller. And I do think that idea of the examples of the laissez-faire capitalism being operated is much more plausible and a much bigger thing. So I completely agree with Amar's points there. In terms of the arguments for capitalism and the arguments for investment healthcare. So, I mean, I think the question is exactly right. I think this goes back to those old debates about capitalism versus socialism, and the perceived failure of socialism being that human beings are innately greedy and innately thrive and strive to be better than the person next to them, and that what capitalism provides is the space for them to be better than their neighbor. And of course, the response from the socialist is to say, well, not necessarily. This is something that we can manage in certain kinds of ways. So, just in terms of the market, there is an argument that if you have a market, then you have innovation and investment. I mean, I'd want to see that. I'd want to see the evidence for that. I'd want to see the evidence for that in different settings and different contexts. And also, of course, given what we've been talking about, there are different ways of managing markets. And it may well be that there's a way of managing a market in a way that allows investment and innovation and improvement, but which protects the interests of patients, and which provides a healthcare system which is comprehensive and beneficial to the people of India.
So you're suggesting that we should be able to capture the innovation, enterprise, and investment and the energy, but do it in a manner that is beneficial and not allow it to run amok in a very laissez-faire fashion.
It feels like that should be happening. I mean, I don't know how to solve the Mars problems. I don't know how to solve those big structural problems. And I think it does need to be at that level. I think that's the level at which I do think there's a tendency for us to try to fix the problems that we can deal with, the small problems. So we all talk to doctors and are doctors and have been doctors, and so we try to fix the little problems, and the big problems that are really doing the work don't actually get addressed, and they're hard to fix because they require everybody.
Right. Thank you. Professor Patel, any reflections on any of the questions?
Yeah, I would just mention about doctors, not in terms of income security, but in terms of security from violence. Because violence is actually taken by doctors who are in public sector. And the difficulty is there is a big overload, there is too much of rush, they're overworked, everything. And yet it's the patients and patients' relatives who do this. The interesting thing is that, there's this common saying that if you draw a line and then you draw a bigger line alongside, the bigger line becomes, the smaller line becomes, the previous line becomes smaller and the other line becomes bigger. Now, hospitals which have been very, very reputed hospitals, public hospitals, very reputed, first-class service, everything, you create insurance in such a way and allow reimbursement of government employees from private hospitals. And those very hospitals which are very reputed and very highly placed become the smaller line. So it's really interesting to see how the private hospitals come in, corporate hospitals come in, and the government hospitals shrink or appear to shrink. And yet the people want services of the same kind that were provided to them earlier. I can give examples of many such hospitals in Delhi, which I have seen over 45 years. And this has happened to government hospitals because the same hospital has been used by other people now. It is not being used by politicians. It is not being used by bureaucrats. It is now being used by lower middle class, working class people, and the conditions of the hospital change. So I think at the government level, there needs to be some kind of a policy where you need to cater to public hospitals in a much more responsible way, provide better income security, provide better security from violence, provide better services. There are hospitals in Delhi where doctors don't have a place to sit properly. They do not have a place where they could have their lunch. They do not have a place where to drink water. They have to carry water from home. All kinds of things are there. So public hospitals are not something which are now treated as very spanky establishments like the private ones. The private ones are more like hotels, and corporate ones are more like hotels, and the expenses are very high. And these expenses are met out of government reimbursements. And I think that is one dimension that we need to look at.
Okay, Amar, we'll give you the last word.
I'll be very, very brief. Three questions are there. The first one, let me take up fast because it is a shorter one, is about whistleblowers. I think the issue of whistleblower is very, very important. And unfortunately, in India, there is absolutely no mechanism to protect the whistleblower. Whistleblowers in a system like India, where there is a lot of corruption, a lot of unethical practices going on, are very important in order to generate public voices against such practices. But they are so unprotected that most of the whistleblowers in India end up paying for either for their life or the job and the security. So I think that is the major problem that needs to be solved. And there has a whistleblowers bill.
Sorry, I've lost the link.
Sorry.
Ma'am, you're back. We can hear you, ma'am. It's okay without video, ma'am.
Okay, yeah. So that is one dimension. The other dimension is we need to also make it very clear that people, that medical health providers.
Dr. Patel, okay, please go ahead and conclude because we are losing your connection. And Amar was actually midway in his comment.
Okay, so I just want to mention that there is a need to publicize the fact that public hospital doctors and medical staff are overworked.
Okay, we'll get back to Amar. Maybe Shefalika, you can message her that we are just closing now. Amar,
thank you.
So let me finish the whistleblower thing. There was a whistleblowers bill, I think, brought about in 10, 15 years back. And that bill is still available, I think, on the internet, but it was never taken up by the government seriously. And the same thing is about the criminal justice system, where we require witness protection. And that is also not a tradition in India. And as a consequence, a large number of criminal cases go west. Nobody gets punished there. So second thing is about investment. That is where I have to say something more critical. Because this belief that private sector brings investment in health needs to be looked at with little more balance. My experience of interacting with the policymakers in last 30 years or 35 years has been pretty high, and I can tell you with a lot of confidence that large number of private investment in the hospital sector in India has taken place because government has provided a huge amount of subsidy. You give me any name and you will find that they have been given huge amount of subsidy. The second thing I have found in interaction with them in the policy bodies was that the first thing they will demand is that if you want us to invest here, please take away all the regulation. No regulation, give us free hand, then and then we will invest. I give you example, in medical devices sector, which is coming up in a big way in India. And there was a big uproar after international investigative journalists brought out, the kind of malpractices that took place with the medical devices. And so government thought of bringing up a law, a separate law to regulate them, saying that we'll create like a drug controller system or drug regulator, a medical device regulator, a separate system for them, because this industry is coming up in a big way. Massive pressure on the government. Don't do it. Even Europe don't have a separate regulator for the medical devices. What is it? It is clubbed with EMA. And that's why it is one of the least regulated sector. And that's another thing that I have seen is that they will invest provided you give them full liberty to loot people. The third thing they say is that why do we invest in areas where there is no consumer demand? People may be sick in Bihar, but why should I open a hospital in Bihar rural area if people have no money to buy my services? You're talking about corporate 5-star services, but they will not operate it. They will say that, yes, we will do it, provided government buys their services from us on behalf of them and give us a profit on it. So they will go and do and say that we are bringing investment and we are bringing everything, but you will find behind all of them, there is a policy decision which is costing the public exchequer and the rights of the patient. That you must keep it in mind. So yes, you may apparently see they're bringing investment, but that investment is tagged to so many other things that are around. Okay, these are the two major things. I think there is a third about overcrowding in publishing, which Dr. Tulsi Patel has already talked about, so I will not go into that.
Well, one ray of hope is the recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission, which has asked for strengthening of the public healthcare infrastructure, right from the village level sub-center to the municipal hospitals and the larger hospitals, but essentially also saying that local bodies should be given the funds so that they can actually control the expenditure. Maybe people's participation can be strengthened through that. Let us hope so. Maybe there are some rays of hope that we should utilize, or at least there are some opportunities for reform that we should utilize. So this has been a very rich discussion. Again, I will not attempt to summarize it, but it appears that there is MLAs, but it is potentially fixable if we take some measures, and those measures have been suggested by the panelists, and they definitely include regulatory measures which have to be appropriately enforced with a political will. Secondly, market corrections, recognizing that the market is operating. There are some distortions that are brought in by the market. Even economists of repute have said that there are market failures in health, but it is possible for us to try and apply market corrections and steer it rather than let the market run amok, but not to abandon some of the advantages brought about by the market. That's what's been suggested by the panelists, but essentially we have to be very careful about how the market operates. And the third, of course, is that the public oversight, if we can actually bring in much closer public oversight rather than leaving it only to sort of oversight by the peers, because self-regulation has largely failed. But if we can actually get in many other disciplines into play, and if a broader spectrum of the society is actually providing the kind of oversight, it might function much better in public interest. And the last one, of course, is whether it is a capitalist structure or a socialist structure, the moral moorings of medical education must be restored, because without that sense of commitment to the fundamental ethos of the health profession and the medical care profession, we are going to have distortions in whichever society the medicine is going to be practiced. So the moral moorings of this profession will have to be restored. And that is where I believe health professional education has to be steered. But all of these forces, which are likely to be corrective in nature, need to be brought together in order to change the situation, which is actually worsening day by day. Thank you very much to the panel. I'm sure we will have more discussions on this matter before Amar starts launching his popular movement, and then we'll have to look at how to bail him out. Thank you.
Hope you will come to bail me out. I really need it.
or share yourself. Okay, bye then. Thank you.
Okay, see you. Bye-bye.
On the cheerful note, Shafalika, we hand it back to you. I thank all the panelists.
Okay, see you. Bye-bye.